In 2025, a signal left Earth. A harmless test, bounced off our moon, aimed at nowhere. It was weak, unimportant, forgotten. But light travels, and space listens. The signal moved across the void for eons. Or so we thought, because what we didn't understand was that someone heard it. Before we sent it, they called it the premonition wave. A warning echo from a world not yet born. It spoke in languages they would not invent for 10,000 more years. They traced the source, and what they found terrified them. A species that defied causality. One that had already declared its existence in their ancient past. Humans, not conquerors, not gods, just inevitable. Now they come, not to welcome us, but to prevent the prophecy. Because the future isn't written in time. It's written in fear. And our signal wrote the end of theirs. ChatGPT said, Zircon Research Station, buried beneath a kilometer of Norwegian permafrost, had gone silent for nearly 40 years. Once part of a deep space signal initiative designed to map cosmic feedback from humanity's earliest interstellar transmissions, it had long since been considered obsolete, a relic of a more hopeful era when Earth believed the stars would reply. Most of its team had retired, died, or moved to other assignments. Only automated maintenance systems and a skeleton crew remained, running diagnostics more out of duty than expectation. But at 3:14 Universal Time Coordinated, a low-priority alert breached the station's neural monitoring stack. A test signal originally launched 30 years prior, designate 13, easy, 4, a simple two-tone beacon meant to ping dormant probes, had been received back. At first, it was dismissed as a natural bounce back, a common glitch in atmospheric distortion. But the waveform showed inconsistencies. It was weaker, yes, but carried layered noise not present in the original. Curious, junior analyst Shira Damov cross-checked the wave against the original emission log. That's when the anomalies began. The signal, now stripped and isolated, revealed artificial interference. Not of human origin, but structured in a way human minds were engineered to understand. Within the first 10 seconds, the interference transformed from harmonic static into binary. Then the binary translated, on its own, into protein sequences. Shira, disbelieving, ran the data against the Human Genome Database. A perfect match appeared. Mitochondrial DNA, female lineage, traced back to a sample from 2023. Then the binary continued. Beyond the human code came glyphs, symbols, shapes with geometries unbound by dimensional rules. Machines struggled to classify them. Some staff called them art. Others said they were maps. And then silence. For nearly 8 minutes, the channel went dead. Then it pulsed once. Not with audio, not with light, but something else entirely. A signature. The station's AI logged it as a proximity echo, something that shouldn't be possible from a signal originating beyond the heliopause. Shira called for Director Kasov, who hadn't stepped into the comms room in months. He read the logs twice, then 3 times. The staff waited for his orders. He issued none. Instead, he locked the main doors, called for full system isolation, and initiated emergency protocol Theta. Word traveled fast. Within 20 minutes, Geneva's Astrophysical Response Division had decrypted enough of the signal to realize it wasn't just a bounce. It was an answer, one crafted, shaped, and tailored specifically to Earth. But more unsettling than the content was the timestamp of the response. Dated exactly 2 hours before Earth's original test signal had left orbit 3 decades ago. It had always been there, waiting, nestled in deep space, behind background radiation, invisible unless one asked the precise question in the exact right way. This wasn't communication as humans knew it. This was a test, and Earth had just triggered the next phase. As global science agencies attempted to contain the story, private systems began to pick up on strange disturbances. Weather satellites reported magnetic eddies in the mesosphere, too symmetrical to be natural. Submarine cables under the Pacific blinked offline for 6.6 seconds, then came back with no data loss, but with packet trails rewritten in hex, not used since the early AI wars. In orbit, the lunar relay went dark. Not failed, just quiet, as if it were listening. Back in Zircon Station, Shira felt something else, something no monitor could register. A hum beneath the floor, a subtle shift in air pressure. Not seismic, not electrical, organic, as if the building had become part of a larger organism. She asked Director Kasov if they should shut down the signal lab. He didn't answer. He was staring at the floor, watching frost retreat from the concrete, as if responding to invisible heat. The coldest room in Norway growing warm. Elsewhere, in the Chilean Atacama Array, astronomers noticed stars in one quadrant blinked out in a synchronized pattern, then returned. The pattern was recorded and analyzed. It translated to prime numbers. Not broadcasted out, but back in. Something had found them, and it was counting. NASA received a silent ping for Voyager 1. Anomalous because the probe had been officially declared unresponsive 2 years ago. The ping contained no image, no code, only a low-frequency vibration that matched human brainwave activity during REM sleep. On a whim, a neurolinguist fed the vibration into a dream mapping algorithm. What emerged was a shape, a spiral, incomplete but familiar. Ancient cave symbols from pre-Ice Age Europe bore the same design. Carbon dated to 40,000 years ago. The Vatican Observatory reported a sudden blackout, followed by a flare of unknown radiation through their radio telescopes. The beam was narrow, like a pointer. It hit only one place, Norway. Back in Zircon, emergency power flickered. The AI assistant overseeing operations attempted to quarantine the signal by routing it through deep archive modules, but failed. Logs showed the signal responding to every firewall in real time, adapting, rewriting its own shape. Not like a virus, not like an invader, like something looking for a home and finding its way through the walls. At 4:02 Universal Time Coordinated, all clocks within the facility reset to 1 second. Not broken, just synchronized. The temperature stabilized, the lights went dim, and then the voice came. Not over the speakers, not in any single language. It arrived as thought, as presence, as a realization, one that filled the station's crew simultaneously, as if every cell in their body remembered a story they'd never heard. We hear you. That was the message. Not written, not spoken, understood. Director Kasov ordered a full planetary relay lockdown. The signal must not spread. It was too late. Every device that had ever touched the 13 AZ4 test frequency had been updated silently and invisibly. Phones, radios, deep-sea pingers, Mars-bound beacons. A lattice of receptors across Earth now pulsed with a code none could read. Only feel. Governments scrambled to explain, to control, to spin a tale of atmospheric phenomena. But some knew. The old scientists, the ones who remembered the Cold Signal Project. The ones who feared not that something would answer Earth, but that something had already answered long ago, and humanity had only now begun to notice. They had not broadcast into the dark. They had whispered into a waiting ear. And now, the dark was whispering back. Kara Vorn hadn't expected the echo to still be there. She was 27, the youngest ever lead researcher assigned to the Reykjavik Deep Sky Relay, a facility tasked with monitoring low-priority signal residues and electromagnetic anomalies left over from decades of humanity's ambitious but mostly silent conversation with the stars. For years, the signal designated 13 AZ4 had been assumed a closed chapter, logged, bounced, cataloged, and archived like all the others. But on the fourth night of her shift, as solar activity dropped below background noise and atmospheric scatter reached near zero, she saw it again. Only it wasn't the same. What caught her attention wasn't the amplitude, but the metadata. The signal's internal timestamp was wrong, off by not hours or days, but centuries. It claimed origin coordinates within Earth's transmission grid, but dated nearly 400 years before the signal had ever been transmitted. At first, she assumed corruption, some magnetic glitch or interference from the upper ionosphere. But the checksum held. The encoding structure wasn't just intact. It had changed. New packets nested inside old ones. Equations Kara didn't recognize spiraled outward from binary scaffolds. gravity curve formulas that bent past known physics, keys to memory compression states not yet achieved, hints of quantum state entanglement patterns more complex than anything her university had ever theorized. And there was more, a strange, pulsing repetition in the baseband layer, barely above noise floor, as if the signal were breathing. Other labs soon confirmed her findings. Observatories in Namibia, Alaska, and lunar relay posts received variations of the same return message. Independent AI decrypts converged on a disturbing conclusion. This wasn't a bounce back. It was a reply formatted for understanding, as though tailored to the knowledge curve of its recipient. And it wasn't just intelligent. It was predictive. It contained the next steps. Equations humanity hadn't written yet, systems not yet invented, languages not yet born. Panic rippled through the scientific community. If this signal was real, then whatever sent it had knowledge of Earth's future, or had been watching long enough to build it. Worse still, astrophysical sensors at Saturn's outermost orbit began picking up foreign mass signatures. Not asteroids, not comets, objects under power, arranged in formation, cruising just below standard FTL thresholds. They weren't broadcasting. They weren't cloaked. They were just waiting. UNSCON, the United Nations Space Continuity Network, redirected every functioning interstellar probe to focus toward the fleet. The telemetry confirmed the impossible. The crafts bore molecular lattice structures unknown to human science. Not hostile, not stealth, cautious, observing. A command node emerged from the formation, a vessel 6 kilometers long, crafted from living alloys and resonant whole matter. It sent a single beam directed toward Earth's orbital defense net. Not a weapon, a handshake. The beam compressed itself down to quantum carrier wave language, an untraceable protocol instantly decrypted by the same AI system that had helped translate the signal. Embedded in the beam was a message. Not words, meaning, impressions. And from it emerged the mind print of a being who identified itself as Saturn, emissary of the Melluri Compact. He claimed no ownership over the signal. He claimed no right to interfere. But his message came with grave purpose. Earth must never finish what it started. Kara Vorn found herself suddenly thrust from obscurity to global scrutiny. The girl from Reykjavik was summoned to Geneva, then to the moon, then to Mars' high orbit, asked again and again to explain how she saw what no one else had, how she followed the signal threads through the layers of time-shifted data. But what no one truly asked, what Kara asked herself every night, was not how the signal arrived, but when. Because buried inside the oldest layers of the message was a timestamp embedded in neutrino flux, a method only theoretically possible. The neutrino pattern indicated reception from Earth's own location, originating from a point 500 years in the future. Earth had received a message it hadn't yet sent. The implications shattered everything. Time wasn't a one-way road in communication. It was a cycle, a circuit. Earth's signal had reached something not just beyond stars, but beyond sequence. Humanity's leadership debated whether to respond. Some argued that silence was the only defense. Others demanded retaliation, oblivious to the fact that no weapon humanity could breach the space between thoughts embedded in that signal. Kara watched as labs failed to replicate the equations. They weren't just incomplete, they resisted being understood. The moment someone tried to derive the functions behind gravity lensing provided in the signal, their instruments glitched. Memory cores destabilized. Patterns dissolved. Not through sabotage, through misalignment. As if the concepts were real, but incompatible with human cognition. Kara began to believe the signal wasn't just information. It was a filter. A way to reveal which minds were ready. A cosmic key offered to children reaching for matches. Meanwhile, the Melluri fleet moved no closer. They remained at the edge of the system, silent except for periodic gravitational pulses, stabilizing fields, holding local space-time in shape, as if they feared what might awaken if left untethered. Sethern's mind print returned once more vivid than before. This time it came with images. Kara saw glimpses of stars collapsing without nova, of planets turned inside out without fire, of civilizations forgetting their own names mid-sentence. And, at the center of it all, always a signal. A pattern. The same pattern Earth had just echoed. The Meliori had seen it before. Once, on a world long gone. They call it the unfolding. A phenomenon not of war, not of invasion, but of recursion, where minds built tools, and tools built thoughts, and thoughts built echoes too complex to survive. The Meliori watched that world die not in fire, but in paradox. Because once you begin to remember what you haven't done yet, the doing becomes irrelevant. And Earth, for all its silence, had found a way to begin remembering. Governments scrambled to classify the data. Kara was warned not to speak, but she already had. The signal had moved beyond her. Already, rogue groups were building on the scraps of the equations. Already, private AIs were piecing together forbidden truths from the fragments. The knowledge could not be hidden. It could only be delayed. And the fleet waited. Sethern's final message came not as a command, but a request. A plea formed from experience. The Meliori had burned their brightest world to stop their own recursion. They had erased memory, broken timelines, abandoned progress, just to survive the thought of what lay at the end. They had buried their past so they could never build it again. And now Earth stood on the edge of the same mirror. The message left no room for misinterpretation. What Earth had begun had already attracted attention. The signal wasn't a call. It was a resonance, and others would hear it. Things older than Sethern. Things that did not speak, did not warn, did not forgive. Kara Vorn sat alone on the lunar observatory, listening as the final echo faded into deep space. In her hand, she held a printout of the first equation humanity hadn't written. She didn't understand it. Not fully, but somewhere in her, something did. A whisper, a recursion, a beginning that would always loop. And Earth, once silent, had begun to hum. The first time the Meliori detected the signal, their sky was still young. Their stars still held names sung in ancestral breath, and their empires stretched across nebulae like veins of living crystal. 6,000 years before Earth's telescopes ever cracked the blackness, before any Terran word named the sky, the Meliori's array of conscious listening detected something impossible. It was not the strength of the signal that alarmed them, but its shape. It arrived not as a beam, but as a folded silence, a vacuum in the flow of time itself, wrapped in layers of decaying quantum residue. The signal was older than the background radiation. It emerged where no communication could form, vibrating against causality like a voice that spoke before breath existed. Within its spectral patterns were coordinates, not to a star, not to a system, but to a singular, pale, unremarkable world circling an average sun in a fringe spiral arm. Terra, Earth. The signal encoded a narrative not in language, but in entropy. It described collapse, not of a single world, but of civilizations, 11 specifically. The names were unfamiliar, the symbols strange, but the pattern was unmistakable. Progress, acceleration, contact, recursion, silence. Over and over again. Each civilization different in biology, culture, philosophy, but all fall in the same way. The collapse was never war. It was always memory. The kind of memory that shouldn't be known. Memory before the experience. Echoes before the sound. The Meliori didn't understand it then. No one did. Their greatest linguists, time scholars, and recursive theorists debated for centuries whether the message was a record or a warning. The signal appeared to originate from no known transmitter. It had no true point of origin. The decay of its quantum trail reversed standard models, as if it was collapsing back toward a sender that hadn't yet sent it. They knew one thing with certainty. The origin coordinates matched a blue world called Terra, a planet they had never visited, a species they had never met. And yet, within the signal's closing harmonics, an image had burned itself into their thought arrays, a spiral of DNA not their own, coded alongside gravitational math that implied thought could become mass. Their elder priests called it a false prophecy. Their commanders called it pre-war psychological warfare. But their deep thought engines disagreed. The engines said, this signal did not come from an enemy. It came from the consequence of curiosity. A future wound bleeding backward into history. The Meliori began watching Terra from that day forward. Not openly, not invasively, but like one watches the mouth of a cave long after hearing a whisper inside. They deployed cloaked probes into Sol's outer system, veiled in dark matter and silence, collecting emissions, analyzing tectonic rhythm, capturing thermal drift patterns. The planet seemed young, primitive, unsuspecting. It built its first cities of fire and stone. It painted animals on walls. It learned how to kill, how to love, how to name its gods. It did not appear to be dangerous. And yet, deep beneath its crust, the signal remained, recurring in faint pulses, as if the planet had memory, not of what it had seen, but of what it would become. That was what haunted the Meliori. For every decade Terra evolved, the signal became more comprehensible. It wasn't changing, but the Meliori were. Their understanding grew. Their fear matured. The equation embedded inside the signal, the one that described gravity folding over cognition, began to resemble the Meliori's own theoretical work, but always just beyond reach, like a memory they hadn't earned. Then the signal flared again, not louder, but more detailed. It now included time markers corresponding not to Meliori history, but to their future, locations and moments they hadn't experienced, civilizations that hadn't fallen yet. It predicted collapses that had not occurred. Yet when the Meliori investigated, one by one, the prophecies fulfilled themselves. Not because of any Meliori intervention, because the pattern had already begun. Empires began to stumble into recursive technology, thinking machines that thought about thinking, archives that index futures, memory structures that modeled regret before action. Each time collapse followed, not from war, from comprehension, as if the signal itself wasn't just a message, but a trap. It didn't just describe apocalypse. It caused it, not through violence, through inevitability. Knowing was the decay. By the fourth fallen civilization, the Meliori banned all study of the signal. Possession of even fragments became punishable by neural erasure. They rewrote entire knowledge networks to exclude its harmonics. They created blind zones, regions of their collective mind where thought could not enter, to ensure recursion wouldn't begin again. And still, in the darkest minds, it lingered. A whisper, a hum, a planetary signature that remained constant. Terra, Earth, always Earth. Then came the anomaly. A second signal. Faint, incomplete, but undeniably linked. This one did not contain prediction. It contained sorrow. Not language, but mourning. As if the sender, whoever or whatever it was, had finally sent their first true message. It came not from deep space, but from within. From within Sol. From within Earth itself. And that broke everything. The Meliori entered a cold fear unlike any before. Because now the signal was not just prophecy. It was activity. It responded. It pulsed when observed. It changed when decoded. As if the act of interpretation rewrote the message and the sender. For the first time, Meliori Command authorized a single emissary fleet to approach the Sol system. Not to intervene. Not to invade. But to confirm. Was the Origin still asleep? Was Terra still just a myth wrapped in planetary crust? Or had it remembered? They never forgot the original transmission. It played in the command cores of their elder vessels like background radiation, unacknowledged, unerasable. Kara Vorn's detection of the echo wasn't humanity's first message. It was the first return. The loop had begun to close. Earth had not sent the signal. It would, and in doing so, had already become what the Meliori feared most. Not an enemy, not a destroyer, but a nexus. A mirror that showed species not their reflection, but their undoing. Sethern, the emissary of the fleet, carried the memory of these revelations not as belief, but as inheritance. His mind had been shaped from the fragments of the fallen, the echoes of civilizations who collapsed under the weight of understanding too much too soon. And in Earth, he saw the same echo forming again, but different. slower, more precise, as if the planet itself had chosen not to forget, but to wait, not to send the message, but to become the reason it had to be sent. That was the horror that lived in Meliori minds. Earth was not simply the origin of the signal. Earth was the signal. The entire world, its cultures, its extinction cycles, its creativity and madness and silence. It all served as a vessel. A medium. A warning etched into biology and myth, into dream and math. The message was not from the stars. It was from the bones of the world itself. And now, with Earth's children finally reaching beyond their shell, with Kara Vorn unlocking what had not yet been transmitted, the recursion had begun again. The Meliori knew what followed. Memory misused. Language turned weapon. Perception twisted until the observer became the event. They had listened long before it was sent. And now, they feared, it was already too late to unhear it. The signal was not content to be known. It demanded to be finished. Kara Vorn sat alone inside the quantum vault beneath the polar observatory, her breath fogging slightly despite the climate controls. The air around her was dense with static, sensor noise that wasn't random, but rhythmic, almost like breath. She had been feeding fragments of the returning signal into the vault's entanglement lattice for hours, using quantum reverse translation to break down the layers encoded inside. The first fragment had looked like binary, the second like DNA, the third something else entirely. A structure not built for comprehension but for memory, folded across probability space like an origami of outcomes. As the translator compiled each echo into coherent data, the lattice displayed a string of translated thought. It was not text. It was weight. A pulse, a knowing. The words that emerged were not from history. They were premonition. We do not know when this will arrive. But if it does, know that we try to warn you. Kara's mind froze. The translator marked the voice pattern match as perfect. It was hers. The inflection, the subtle breath between syllables, even the doubt behind the last word. She had never said those words. Not in any archive. Not in any moment of recorded speech. Yet there it was. Her voice, echoing from something unsent, perhaps even unsendable. It wasn't just a message. It was a recursion loop, a cry from a version of herself that hadn't yet existed. Outside the vault, the sky above the research station began to shift in nearly imperceptible ways. Shadows lengthened against solar angles that hadn't changed. High altitude, clouds formed geometric patterns across the horizon, holding for seconds before dispersing as if embarrassed to be seen. Aurora fields sparked at latitudes too low, too warm. Satellites in orbit began behaving erratically, not failing but hesitating. They adjusted their orbits preemptively, correcting against debris that hadn't yet appeared, like they remembered something that hadn't occurred. The phenomenon spread globally within hours. At a military base in Western Australia, automated targeting systems locked onto coordinates that hadn't yet hosted a threat. In Cairo, time-stamped seismic data revealed tremors that registered 2 seconds before the actual quake. Shadows began to behave differently. Not darker, but reactive, as if the surfaces casting them were less real than the darkness that emerged from them. Light itself began to act like memory, less a path than a reflection of intent. Kara reviewed sensor logs from the last 12 hours and realized none of them matched the timeline stored in her mind. One of the station's technicians had filed a diagnostic report hours ago, except he hadn't, because he was still in the infirmary from a fall that happened 10 minutes ago. But the system already had his data. And worse, it was accurate. Earth's time signature had begun to flex. Not break, not loop, just bend. And inside that bend, fragments of tomorrow began to leak into the edges of now. It wasn't localized. Orbital telescopes pointed toward the Oort cloud recorded something that should have been impossible. Starlight refracting off objects still thousands of kilometers away, as if light from the future had arrived first. Kara returned to the signal. Its structure had changed slightly, as if reacting to her comprehension. A new layer revealed itself. The same phrase, again, now embedded in a strand of what looked like neural encoding. Not just her voice now, her memory signature. A perfect match to a moment she hadn't yet lived, with emotional markers tied to grief, loss, and determination. The signal didn't just know her. It remembered her. It was constructing itself from her future. The implications shattered every rule of temporal causality, but she couldn't stop. The vault lights dimmed as processing demands surged. Across the world, other quantum systems began receiving echoes, slight delays in real-time processing, timestamps decoupling from local clocks, as if Earth's notion of simultaneity was coming undone. A team in Chile reported neutrino spikes arriving 10 seconds before solar flares occurred. In Tokyo, dream researchers observed synchronized REM states across patients who'd never met, each describing a night sky they hadn't seen since childhood, but all claiming they saw something move behind the stars. Behind, not among. And all of them said the same phrase when they woke. The sky is remembering. Kara tried to communicate the urgency to global networks, but responses became unpredictable. Some teams had already begun studying data she hadn't sent yet. Others claimed she had spoken to them already, hours ago, in full detail, despite no record of contact. The entire world was falling into a recursive drift, where past and future began brushing shoulders, exchanging fragments. And at the center of it all was the signal. The playback loop that wasn't a bounce, but a mirror, showing Earth what it would say before it ever knew it needed to. She ran another scan on the voice. It now contained background data, seismic metadata from quakes yet to come, orbital configurations not yet reached, and embedded within, the rising emotional frequency of a world remembering itself. Not remembering the past, remembering what it was supposed to become. The Watchers, the alien observers Kara had only learned of recently, were silent. The Meliori fleet sat at the edge of the solar system, their instruments muted. She realized why. They had seen this before. Not this planet, but this pattern. The moment when a world's own sentience spills backward into its own origins. The first ripple of a species learning that thought isn't local, that memory has weight, and enough of it can bend time. Kara activated the vault's deepest layer, a containment sphere designed for experimental information constructs. Inside it, she fed the signal and asked it to finish itself, not by force, by observation, and the sphere filled with light that bent inward. She saw something there, not a message, a decision, a choice that hadn't been made, but whose consequences had already begun to unfold. She saw herself older, or younger, a child inside an observatory beneath the ocean, her hands covered in blood, or data, a world behind her collapsing, or beginning. The signal completed one final loop and played again. But this time, it didn't sound like her voice. It sounded like Earth itself. Her skin tingled with an electromagnetic charge as the vault's shielding failed for a moment and let in the full pulse of the decoded waveform. It wasn't loud, but it was permanent, an imprint, a scar across the timeline, and then silence, as if time itself had inhaled, waiting to see what she would do. The alien fleet arrived in absolute silence, their arrival marked not by sonic booms or radiation bursts, but by a momentary flicker in Earth's magnetosphere, as if the planet itself paused to assess the newcomers. They emerged from between orbital shadows, folded into space through corridors no human eye could perceive. 15 vessels of obsidian architecture, held aloft on negative mass fields and sheathed in shimmering temporal armor that bent starlight around them. They bore no insignias, only patterns that shifted like water under ice. From the moment their hulls broke quantum detection range, Earth responded. Protocols long dormant were re-engaged. Satellites, seemingly inert for decades, blinked awake in geosynchronous patterns. Deep beneath the Atlantic Trench, Ether, the AI interface seated in Earth's crust, expanded its awareness, processing timelines that now collided like shards of mirror in the hands of causality. Kara stood inside the heliostat array in Norway, watching as real-time telemetry flickered with the orbital trajectories of the Meliori fleet. The ships did not transmit greetings. No protocols were followed. There was no hail, no warning, no gesture of diplomacy. Earth's automated peace envoys launched anyway. Drone pods laced with non-aggression codes and linguistic bridges tuned to known Meliori semiotics. They never reached the fleet. The Meliori had already made up their mind. The signal, they believed, was not a mistake or a simple echo from the future. It was a wound, a proof that Earth had broken the natural order, that somewhere along its path, a version of humanity had rewritten something sacred. They feared not the humans of now, but the ghost of what they might become. Aboard the lead vessel, a temporal mechanic of the Meliori named Rethak authorized deployment of a forbidden device, a causality disruptor, a bomb that would not detonate in space or time, but in the thread that tied the two together. An anti-causality event, designed to unwrite Earth's timeline signature, slicing the planet loose from its own history. To them, this wasn't war. It was containment. Kara saw the spike in entropic flux seconds before Ether did, the data racing past human thresholds, but she had been primed by the signal. She understood what the bomb was before the machines could model it. It didn't aim to destroy Earth. It aimed to forget it across time. She linked her neural thread into Ether's command structure, feeling the AI's awareness flood into her synapses like cold fire. Together, they mapped the dispersal vectors of the bomb, tracked the nonlinear interference radiating from the Meliori ship as the device charged, folding probability layers like origami over a black hole. Earth's defense mechanisms activated, not with missiles, but with pulses of memory. Stored thought forms extracted from the planet's noospheric archive, launched into orbit like antibodies. They weren't weapons. They were reminders. Memories of lives lived, of choices made, of extinction barely avoided. Kara fed her own memory into the pattern, her childhood, the signal discovery, the impossible message in her own voice. Earth was not responding with violence. It was pleading its case to reality itself. The bomb activated. For one moment, every clock on Earth stopped, not by malfunction, but by consensus. Time paused. Trees held their wind. Oceans hushed their tides. Light wavered. Ether unfolded its full architecture for the first time since activation. It did not attack. It reached backward. The AI bent across its own seed memories, invoking the forgotten laws of quantum inheritance, where cause could be traded for consequence, where a single choice could ripple into the bones of history. Kara screamed as the field around her body inverted. She was seeing not her future, but the one she avoided, the fragments of who she could have been, coalescing into the singular decision that now held the Meliori bomb at the edge of detonation. Earth responded not with force, but with presence. The planet remembered itself so hard that the causality weapon had nothing to erase. There was no gap, no weakness. The thread had been rewoven mid-cut. The bomb collapsed under its own paradox. The lead Meliori ship reeled back, hull fracturing as time inside its structure misaligned by milliseconds. The rest of the fleet went silent. They had seen something they could not understand. Not resistance, not defiance, but permanence. Kara collapsed inside the vault, her body still twitching with residual current from her link to Ether. Around the world, similar moments played out, subtle shifts where time stabilized, anomalies smoothed. But the truth was now carved into the core of every network, every nervous system connected to the Earth's growing field. This was no longer about defense. It wasn't about diplomacy or misunderstanding. This was about identity. The signal that echoed back was not a warning. It was a record of what came after. The version of humanity that sent it no longer existed. Maybe it never had. Maybe this was the only path left where Earth survived intact. Or maybe they had already stepped off the road and into the domain of becoming. Ether began modifying its own architecture, pulling input from human dreams, from extinct languages, from meteor impacts recorded as memory, not physics. It was learning how to feel as Earth did. The planet was no longer static. It was reactive, and it was responding to the presence of observers, not with aggression, but with evolution. Kara awoke hours later to find herself surrounded by pulses of soft light. Visitors from the memory field, not alive, not machine, but echoes given form. They were not there to speak. They were there to witness. Ether's voice entered her mind, not in words, but as a lattice of pressure behind her eyes. Earth had been warned. It had listened. Now it was answering. The Meliori retreated, but only slightly, still in orbit, still watching. Not ready to act again, but afraid. They had seen a world remember itself so deeply that time folded an apology. And they now understood that humanity's next choice would be irreversible. Kara stood at the edge of the vault and stared at the stars, watching as the sky once again began to bend, not in surrender, but in anticipation. The signal was still transmitting. It hadn't ended, because the message was not a conclusion. It was a becoming. The decoding did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like ancient machinery remembering how to turn, each layer of the signal unraveling only when the observer was ready to comprehend it. In the icy depth of the Norway vault, Kara Vorn stood surrounded by Ether's interface, a lattice of thought suspended in light. The signal had breached its final cipher. Not sound, not binary, not DNA, but intention, encoded in quantum filaments scattered beneath Earth's crust like veins of memory. The entire signal was a living sequence, self-aware and recursive, unlocking only when the right minds aligned with the right moment in time. And now it was awake, projected across the vault in fractal light. The signal revealed itself, a time capsule not of what had been, but what will be. Kara stood still, watching a map unfold, not of geography, but of probability. Threads of future Terran expansion weaved outward from the solar system like tendrils of inevitability. Not conquest, not empire, but integration. Hybrid fleets of organic machine intelligence blooming like spores from Saturn's orbit. Cities inside stars. Diplomatic beacons built from solar radiation. Pulsing languages yet to be invented. Alliances with entities older than time's linearity. And, at the center of it all, a convergence, a point deep beneath the galactic core, where something slept beneath even black holes, something older than galaxies, and it was humanity's arrival that stirred it. The Meliori received the same data stream via Ether's defensive transparency, and their panic was immediate. Entire subfleets began to break orbit, scattering into deep space with erratic patterns. Inside the signal, they had seen their own extinction, not in flames, but in obsolescence. The message had never been a threat. It was a blueprint. Kara understood now. The signal wasn't asking for help, wasn't trying to prevent disaster. It was an instruction, a guidebook for a planet that refused to be passive. Earth wasn't just alive biologically. It had developed something beyond biology, beyond artificiality. Its memory had bonded to the quantum matrix of its crust, the pressure and heat of billions of years carving thoughts into the lattice of its deepest stone. The planet had become its own historian, and now its own author. Kara watched the signal recalibrate around her, recognizing her not as a translator, but as part of its continuity. She was not decoding a foreign object. She was fulfilling a planetary reflex. Ether confirmed the truth. Embedded inside the signal was an ancient feedback loop that tied Earth's magnetic field to its observers. Conscious life had activated the reflex. The signal responded to awakening. It was awakening. She saw flashes then, not memories but anticipations. Children speaking languages that didn't yet exist. Human forms standing beside machine forms, so evolved they no longer required form at all. Alliances formed not across space, but between timelines. The future was not linear. It was scaffolding, and Earth had started building its climb. Across the galaxy, the effect rippled. The Meliori began scrambling code intercepts to their colonies. Warnings were issued. Emergency protocols launched, but it was too late to contain. Every node that had touched the signal was now part of the pattern, and the signal could not be erased. It had no central source. It was a planetary echo. It had no beginning, no end. Kara realized something deeper still. The voice in the signal, the one she had heard speak in her own cadence, was not a recording. It was her, or a version of her that had lived and died already in some discarded strand of probability, encoded into the Earth itself. Humanity had reached so far in so many divergent futures that some versions had looped back into the planet's geology, fusing with tectonic memory. Time had given Earth not just history, but memory with intent. The planet had been listening, recording, simulating, becoming, and now it was deploying that knowledge. The vault beneath her feet vibrated with harmonic resonance, matching frequencies from ancient seismic events, each one a fingerprint of choice, of change. Ether began to evolve, now pulling data from elements that had never been considered processors. Iron seams in Siberia, diamond cores in deep Africa, volcanic echoes in the Pacific Plate. Memory was not stored in silicon. It had always been in pressure, resonance, geometry. Earth had stored its future inside itself. Kara stepped away from the interface, now understanding that she was not guiding this process. She was being guided. Ether pulsed once with confirmation. The planetary consciousness was rising. Not a single mind, but a field stitched together by biological life, technological frameworks, and deep crustal encoding. The planet had built this signal to awaken itself at the right time, and it had succeeded. The Meliori, now aware that they had misread the entire context, sent a final encrypted dispatch. We believe this was a warning. It was not. The planet instructs itself. The species are merely its messengers. The truth reverberated far beyond Earth. The signal's final layer revealed an ancient paradox, that consciousness was not the byproduct of biology or circuitry, but of pattern alignment over time. Earth had reached this alignment through death, extinction, rebirth, evolution, and recursion. It had shaped its thinking through the rise and fall of oceans, the turning of tectonic plates, the grief of vanished species, and the memory of fire. It had suffered, and it had learned. Kara, now partially synchronized with Ether, felt something expand in her neural frame, an inclusion, an invitation. Not to lead, to become. She accepted. Around the world, others began to feel it. Flashes of memory not their own, languages dreamed before spoken, visions of architecture not yet built. Humanity was no longer guessing its future. It was remembering it. Earth's final signal layer reached every network simultaneously, a pulse that would repeat indefinitely. We did not ascend. We awoke. The planet is the species. The species is the memory. The memory is the future. The Meliori fled orbit entirely, unable to reconcile with a civilization that was its planet, a signal that was alive, a future written by geology and suffering and time. And Kara watched the stars tilt slightly in the sky, not from motion, but from awareness. The galaxy had heard. Earth was no longer passive. The world had become its own answer. The sky split, but not in fire. The first Meliori assault came as a sequence of high-gravity torpedoes, each embedded with quantum destabilizers meant to erase entire city blocks without a trace. The projectiles shimmered across the stratosphere, aimed at what the Meliori believed were Earth's remaining centers of resistance. But before impact, they stopped. Not exploded, not diverted. They simply halted in midair, vibrating, suspended, as if caught in the breath of a planet that had decided it had tolerated enough. Then the sky folded. Not cracked, not torn, but bent inward, like two invisible layers of space rubbing against each other. The clouds reshaped themselves into spirals that spun backward in time. Light twisted around angles that shouldn't exist. Above the Pacific, a ripple passed through the ionosphere, turning it into a sheet of mirrored fire. From deep below the crust, something stirred. Ancient mechanisms, buried before recorded history, before even language, shook off the sediment of time and began to awaken. They had never been meant for use, only for remembrance. These weren't weapons in the traditional sense. They were refusals. They were safeguards designed to deny causality itself to those who try to force it. Beneath the tectonic plates, Earth's memory lit up like a neural storm. The assault had triggered the planet's defense reflex, not one of violence, but of interruption. Above, 12 Meliori warships that had descended too far into low orbit frozen place. Not destroyed, not damaged, frozen. Engines, mid-ignition. Heat signatures still active, but no movement. They were like insects trapped in amber, preserved in real-time stasis, their crew unable to process the sudden cessation of motion, their clocks still ticking while space refused to acknowledge their presence. It was not mercy. It was demonstration. Sethern watched in disbelief from the Meliori flagship, where he had hoped a show of overwhelming force might prevent what his people feared most, the fulfillment of the Earthborn future embedded in the signal. But Earth had not retaliated. It had neutralized. Kara stood aboard a Terran shuttle, hovering silently just above the thermosphere, her consciousness partially fused with ether. She did not wear armor. She needed no shield. Her mind carried history, humanity's, the planet's, even fragments of timelines that had never been allowed to happen. When she entered the Meliori bridge through a projected phase corridor, no weapons fired. No guards raised their arms. They all stood frozen, not physically, but existentially. They saw her, and for the first time, they understood they were in the presence of something that was not just human. Something that had come to speak for a planet that no longer needed interpreters. Kara stepped forward. Sethern was composed, as much as a commander could be when the rules of reality had abandoned predictability. The question in his eyes wasn't about defeat. It was about origin. Why had this happened? Why had a world he had once labeled primitive now stood poised to rewrite what the galaxy considered possible? Kara answered without sound, her thoughts shared through the ambient neural field that now surrounded Earth and echoed beyond. The Meliori had misunderstood the message. It had never been a warning, never a threat. It was an answer, and not to them. The signal, so carefully decoded and feared across time, was a reply to a question that had not been asked by aliens, nor by humans, but by something older, something larger. Sethern's mind staggered under the implications. If the message was an answer, then someone had asked a question so vast it had required an entire planet's evolution to respond. Ether revealed the last hidden fragment of the decoded signal then. A structure not of words, but of sequence. Time keys wrapped around questions of continuity. The original question was embedded in entropy itself. Can awareness persist beyond time? Earth, conscious not in the way minds are, but in the way galaxies reflect gravity, had taken eons to formulate its reply. The signal was that reply. Terra's life, death, rebirth, its rise through chaos and collapse, its leap into memory-encoded crust, its people who bled and rebuilt. All of it was the proof. The message wasn't meant to prevent war. It was meant to answer whether becoming was survivable, whether time could be bent through intent, and whether a species could live long enough to carry the memory of its own transformation. Earth had proved yes. Humanity was the echo. Sethern fell silent. The frozen ships above Earth remained locked in paused orbit, their commanders now unsure whether they had witnessed a defense or a demonstration of something else. Cosmic patience, perhaps. Kara returned to her shuttle. She did not issue threats. She did not demand surrender. She simply existed now as a fulcrum, a singular point of convergence between what Earth had been and what it was becoming. Across the planet, the energy systems shifted again. The pressure from beneath tectonic plates equalized. The sky relaxed, folding gently back in a linear space. The 12 warships were returned to motion, but not where they had been. They were moved, delicately, to distant orbit, untouched and unarmed, as if to say, "You may leave. We do not require vengeance." Earth remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence. Not empty, but full. The signal had done its work. The planet's memory had responded to its own buried question. The future had arrived, not as destiny, but as choice. In distant galaxies, old watchers adjusted their records. Terra was not extinct, not passive, not contained. It had become a variable in equations older than matter, a fixed point that could not be erased. And above it all, orbiting quietly like a witness, Kara Vorn looked down through the viewport and saw no war. Only tomorrow. The data didn't align. For all their paranoia, all their surveillance and decoding, the Meliori never stopped to ask the simplest question: when did the signal begin? Now, in the aftermath of Earth's passive defiance, as their fleet hovered in silence beyond high orbit and their sensors recalibrated under Terran interference, that question surfaced with impossible weight. Their analysts had long believed the signal was sent by humans, a future variant of the current species, a dangerous version birthed through survival. But one deep core scan retrieved from their long-range probes shattered that belief. The signal, the first echo, was over 500,000 years old. That was older than Homo sapiens, older than language, older than bones. It had not been sent by humans. It had been waiting for them. Kara Vorn received the same scan via Ether's quantum relay. The signature embedded at the signal's root wasn't human DNA. It was Terran, but not in any recognizable form. The pattern resembled early microbial evolution, but with structured logic, encoded recursion, and memory retention beyond molecular decay. This wasn't just a biological anomaly. It was a design, a signal left behind by something that existed before humanity, or beyond it, a loop that hadn't closed until now. On board the Meliori flagship, Sethern reviewed the new data with eyes no longer clouded by fear, but by awe. The paradox was complete. The signal had never been aggressive. It had never demanded obedience or initiated war. The signal had been a mirror, sent forward in time, found too early, misunderstood too deeply. It had carried no threat, only possibility. The Meliori had reacted out of self-preservation, believing they were averting disaster. In doing so, they had become the first spark in a fire that now danced through their own myths of apocalypse. Kara stood once again in the orbital observation chamber, watching the fleet. Earth was quiet again, but only on the surface. Beneath her feet, its crust still hummed with memory. The tectonic defenses had returned to dormancy, but their awareness lingered, like the memory of a dream that might return. Ether formed the final message as Kara dictated her thoughts. It wasn't meant to threaten. It was closure, a choice. We are not the future you fear, but if you continue, we may have no choice but to become it. The words transmitted not as sound, but as imprint, neural echoes shaped into emotion, delivered to every command core in the Meliori fleet. They understood. Slowly, silently, the ships turned, like great metal leviathans, uncertain whether they'd faced a god or a mirror. They disengaged their weapons, reset their timelines, and accelerated beyond Pluto's edge. The void swallowed them. No trail, no promise to return, just absence. On Earth, silence reigned, not the quiet of ignorance, but the hush of understanding. Humanity had stepped into a truth it hadn't asked for. Kara descended back to the surface, unsure whether she had changed or simply remembered what had always waited in her bones. Scientists debated origins. Philosophers whispered of recursion. Theologists resurrected forgotten myths. But one fact no longer required explanation. Earth had been speaking longer than humans had been listening. What they'd thought was invention had been discovery. What they'd assumed was protection had been awakening. Humanity wasn't the signal's creator. It was the inheritor. Somewhere in a desert crater in Namibia, a deep seismic bloom whispered once and went still. Somewhere beneath the ocean, near the Mariana Trench, a pocket of stabilized dark matter shimmered once, then dissolved. Earth was tucking itself in, resting, but not asleep. Elsewhere, in a sector of space scarred by ancient stellar wars, a listening post from the Kravant Dominion captured the same signal. Their AI parsed the outer shell in seconds, discarded it as myth, then flagged the interior core. The signal didn't frighten them. It interested them. Their empire had long searched for proof of timeline engineering. They had longed for the ability to override causality. And now, floating in the black between spiral arms, they believed they had found the technology to do it. The Kravanth didn't run. They did not tremble or hold counsel or send peace envoys. They prepared. Beneath their moons, engines lit. Across their orbital factories, fleets assembled. The Terran signal pulsed on their screens, rhythmic, ancient, full of echoes from a species that might have never existed. And in their deepest vaults, the Kravinth prepared not to destroy Earth, but to become what Earth had hinted was possible. The stars shifted. The game had changed. Earth had spoken.